Hello, and welcome back to One Idea Way. I'm Hayden, and today I want to start with a question. Think about the last time you were completely, embarrassingly, and undeniably wrong about something. Not some small little fact, like a big thing. Something you were extremely confident about. Something that you might have even staked reputation, money, relationships on. What did you do with that experience? If you're like most people, you probably felt a familiar sequence. You deny it, you scramble to reframe your claim, you shift the blame off of yourself, and eventually you kind of quietly bury the entire thing. You move on. You try not to think about it too much in the future. You tell a version of the story later where you come out looking better than it actually happened in real life. And I mean, that's a very human response. I think everyone's done that. It's also, according to the person we're talking about today, one of the most expensive habits you can have. That person is Ray Dalio. Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, which for a long time was the largest hedge fund in the world. He's managed money for sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and governments. By most conventional measures, he's had one of the most successful investment careers in history. But here's the thing about Dalio that makes him genuinely interesting. Aside from just money, he doesn't really think of himself as an investor. He thinks of himself as a student of how things work, a student of cause and effect, a student of systems, a student of the gap between what people believe about reality and what reality actually is. His most famous book isn't called something like How to Beat the Market. It's called Principles. And it's like a manual for how Dalio thinks, how he approaches decisions, processes failures, manages his biases, and tries to get a little closer to what he thinks is the truth over time. I want to spend today with that manual, Principles, not as a list of productivity tips or something as surface level as that, but as a philosophy. Because what Dalio is really describing in his book is fundamentally different from what people experience day to day. It's almost a different relationship with being wrong. And I think that has implications that reach far beyond his initial goal of investing. It all starts with a collapse. It's 1982. Dalio is running Bridgewater, which at this point is just a small operation, not the massive monolithic company it would become. He's been studying the global economy obsessively. He tracks debt cycles, watches credit markets, builds models around all these things, and he's arrived at a conclusion he is certain about. The U.S. economy is heading for a severe depression. Not a slowdown, not a correction, a depression. The same thing that happened in the 1930s. He's analyzed the data, built the case, stress test his reasoning, and he's so convinced about this that he goes on financial television and says so. He positions the reputation of Bridgewater around this view. Then, the exact opposite happens. In August 1982, the stock market begins on one of the greatest bull runs in modern American history. The economy surges. The depression Dalio predicted doesn't just fail to arrive. Markets go on a tear that lasts almost 2 decades. Bridgewater is on the wrong side of almost everything. The firm loses a ton of money. Clients leave. Credibility for his company evaporates overnight. Dalio, who had spent years protecting confidence and expertise and ability to predict this market like it was second nature, is forced to let go of most of his staff. And at one point after this, it's just him. He has to borrow money from his father just to cover basic expenses. He's in his early 30s, and by his own description, he feels like he's been hit by a truck. Now, this is the one that most stories about successful people treat as the obligatory dark night of the soul before the triumphant comeback. We're supposed to admire how he survived this adversity and keep going. But what I find interesting about this tragedy isn't that he survived. It's what he did with the experience intellectually. Because the question he asked himself in that moment wasn't, how do I survive? How do I recover? It was, what did I miss? And that kind of sounds like a subtle distinction at a first glance, but it isn't. It's a completely different orientation to failure. Most people, when they fail, ask questions centered on themselves. How do I get back? How do I protect what remains of my company? How do I explain this in a way that makes me look less stupid? The self, the ego, is the center of the question. Dalio asked a question centered on reality. what is true that I didn't see? What did I get wrong about how the world works? So he went back through everything, not just the recent past. He dug into market history going back 100 years, the 1920s, the 1930s, the post-war period. He was trying to understand debt cycles at a structural level. And what he found was that his model was too simple. He'd correctly identified certain patterns of debt accumulation, but he'd failed to account for how central banks would intervene in modern days, how the Federal Reserve now can pump liquidity into a crisis and prevent a depression from happening in the way he had expected. He hadn't been entirely wrong about the diagnosis. He'd been wrong about the mechanisms created to respond to it. And I think that kind of endpoint is a kind of distinction that you can only really arrive at if you're genuinely trying to understand what happened, not trying to explain it away and make yourself seem like you were right all along. He came out of that period with two things. One, a much richer model of how economies work, one that eventually became the basis for what he would call his economic machine. And two, a deep personal conviction that being wrong is not the enemy. Being confidently wrong without learning from it is. And I think that conviction led to the most quoted line from his book: pain plus reflection equals progress. I think it almost sounds too simple, but I think the quote is worth sitting with because each part of it is much deeper than it seems. Pain by itself teaches you nothing. People experience painful failures constantly and come away having learned absolutely nothing. History is full of people who went bankrupt multiple times making the exact same mistakes and just end up as failures overall. But history is also full of people who experience one significant failure, sat with it carefully, and never made that kind of mistake again. What separates those outcomes isn't intelligence, isn't willpower, isn't luck. It's reflection. And reflection, as Dalio explains it in his book, is not self-flagellation. It's not ruminating on how bad you feel about this big mistake. It's almost like a forensic analysis of the past. You go back to the scene, you reconstruct what happened, you try to identify the specific assumption, framework, model that was wrong, the specific moment where you should have updated your beliefs but you didn't. It's systematic, it's deliberate, it's almost like a cold-blooded reliving of this tragedy, and then you adjust something. You update the model, you add a new principle to your list, you adjust the process. That's the progress of the issue. Dalio actually built a formal tool at Bridgewater called the mistake log, a system that records errors, analyzes root causes, and tracks whether the lessons learned actually changed behavior going forward. It wasn't created as a punishment, just as data collection. Most organizations have almost the opposite culture around mistakes, one where admitting your mistakes is dangerous, where people actively work to sweep their failures under the rug to protect their standing within the country, in the company. Dalio made error analysis in his company a core institutional practice. But here's the thing. The idea of reflecting on mistakes sounds so completely reasonable, almost obvious. So why don't people actually do it? Why is it so rare in practice? Dalio's diagnosis in this is that the obstacle is ego. And I want to be careful with my words here because ego gets used in self-help contexts in ways that feel almost vague. Dalio is using it here more in a specific mechanical sense, as the rest of his work is mechanical. The ego, as he describes it, is the part of you that confuses what you want to be true with what is actually true. It's the part of you that experiences being wrong as an attack on your identity, on who you are as yourself. And because being wrong feels like an identity threat, the ego mobilizes everything in your toolbox to defend against it. Through rationalization, blame shifting, avoidance of data that confirm that you're actually wrong. Now, this ego isn't a character flaw, it's just how human psychology works. We're wired to protect our own self-image. A creature that internalized every failure as evidence of its own worthlessness probably wouldn't survive long enough to reproduce. But what was adaptive in one context becomes a liability in the business world. In a world where your most important job is to navigate uncertainty and make good decisions with incomplete information, the ego's defensive mechanisms actively get in the way. they prevent you from seeing what's really happening under the surface. And Dalio's solution to this is to try and operate from what he calls the higher level you, the part of yourself that can observe your own reactions, notice when your ego is distorting your perception, and choose to prioritize accuracy over what makes your ego feel good. He frames it kind of like having two of yourself in conversation. There's the ego you who wants to be right, to look good, to protect its prior commitments. And then there's the observer you who wants to understand what's actually true, regardless of how it makes your ego you feel. Getting those two selves to work together, that's Dalio's project. And it never fully finishes. It's almost impossible. Dalio, who has thought about this more than almost anyone alive, still describes his ongoing struggles with it. The difference is that he built systems to help him do it, which is how we get to this next part, the culture at Bridgewater. Bridgewater has been described by the people who've worked there as one of the most unusual workplaces on Earth. The foundational principles Dalio built the culture around at Bridgewater were what he called radical truth and radical transparency. Radical truth meant that the norm at his company was to say what you actually thought about ideas, about decisions, about what anyone put on the table, even if they're a manager, if they're someone who's like 10 ranks above you, it doesn't matter. You just say what you think. There was an expectation that you wouldn't soften feedback to protect feelings, that you would raise disagreements openly rather than burying them, that you would challenge an idea, even if it came from someone far, far above you. Radical transparency meant that very little information inequality was happening inside the company. Meetings were recorded and sent to everyone. Most people could access most of what was happening. Almost everything was on record. The underlying logic in this was that most organizational dysfunction comes from the gap between what people actually think and what they say out loud. People sit in meetings, disagree silently with the decision being taken, and execute half-heartedly on a strategy that they never bought into or wanted to complete in the first place. Or they have information that would be valuable to the decision-making process, but don't share it because the social cost, talking back to your boss or whatever, feels too high. Dalio believed that eliminating that gap and forcing the thinking that was happening on the inside into the open would produce better decisions in his company, even if it made a couple more uncomfortable conversations. And it apparently did produce better decisions. Bridgewater's track record over several decades is pretty hard to argue with. But it also produced one of the highest turnover rates of any major financial firm. The culture was described by many former employees as brutal, exhausting, and dehumanizing. There were many documented criticisms of how the transparency principles were applied in practice, whether they were applied equally, whether certain people were held to different standards. It almost felt more like a control mechanism than a truth-seeking tool sometimes in his company. Dalio has engaged with those criticisms to varying degrees. He'd be the first to say that Bridgewater was never perfect. I mean, no company is. But he'd also say that the core ideas remain valid, even if the implementation wasn't always. And personally, I think both things are true. The idea that organizations benefit from creating environments where reality can surface, where disagreement is treated as a valuable input rather than a mutiny, I think that idea is amazing. That idea is correct in all senses. Most organizations desperately need more of that. But the specific implementation of this idea at Bridgewater was extreme. And I don't think that way that they implemented it can work for many people. The lesson probably isn't in practice do exactly what Bridgewater did. It's more take seriously the degree to which social norms in most organizations actively suppress the information that you need to make the best decisions. There's another idea from Dalio that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think that it's honestly underrated. He argues that not all opinions should be weighted equally. And I think that statement's kind of funny. I mean, it'll immediately trigger some people because we live in a cultural moment that is sensitive about the implications of saying some opinions are worth more than others. But Dalio's point is more specific than a general claim about expertise. He's making an argument about how to actually make good decisions under uncertainty. What he calls it is, he names it believability-weighted decision-making. The idea is that when you're trying to figure out what's true in an area you don't fully understand, You should seek out the people who have repeatedly and demonstratively made good judgments in that specific area. And you should weight their views more heavily than the people who haven't. Not because credentials or a track record almost means everything, but because a history of good judgment in a specific area is actually concrete evidence about something real. The alternative, which is how most people actually operate, is to weight opinions based on social proximity, confidence of delivery, hierarchical standards, or how it aligns with what you already believe. You'll ask your friends, you read the sources that actually agree with you already, you find the most confident sounding voice and assume that means it's correct. You seek agreement. Dalio argues that if you actually want good decisions, you have to do something harder. Identify who has actually been right about this kind of thing before, and then listen to them more carefully than you listen to people who are just confident or agreeable. I also want to talk about one of his ideas that ties a lot of these threads together. Dalio's insistence about how life works like a machine. What he means by this is not like life is cold, life is callous, but he means that outcomes emerge from systems. Results can't appear out of nowhere. They're outputs of processes. And if you understand those processes, you can intervene with the outcome intelligently. That changes how you diagnose problems. Most people, when something goes wrong, look at the outcome and just try to fix the outcome. Sales are down, change the sales pitch. A product failed, what's wrong with the product? Dalio's instinct is rather to back up further and ask what system produced this outcome? What mechanism, which operates the same way every single time, generated what we're looking at now? He keeps asking why. Why did this happen? Because of X. Why did X happen? Because of Y. And at some point, he arrives at something that feels like the actual root cause. The deeper structural item that, if you actually fix, prevents the whole chain from recurring. You can see this most clearly in his framework for how economies work, what he calls the economic machine. The core insight here is that economic fluctuations are driven largely by credit. When credit is expanding, people and businesses can spend more than they earn, which drives growth. When credit contracts, spending falls and economy contracts. This plays out over short cycles and long ones. Overlay a longer-term productivity trend on top of that, and you have a framework for understanding patterns that would otherwise look random or chaotic. The reason I bring this up isn't to give a lesson on macroeconomics. It's to illustrate what it looks like to think in systems. Most people look at an economic crisis and see a disaster or a tragedy, a thing that happened, something that is non-negotiable, something that you have to survive. But Dalio looks at the same event and sees a mechanism expressing itself. He asks, what part of the machine produced this output? And I think that's a fundamentally different relationship with events that produces a fundamentally different quality of understanding. And I think this connects also to his broader view on adaptability, which I think is maybe the most underrated part of his whole philosophy. Dalio believes that evolution is the most powerful force in the universe. Not just biological evolution, but evolution as a general principle. Systems that can adapt to their environment persist. Systems that don't disappear. The world is constantly changing, and the organisms and organizations and ideas even that survive are the ones that can respond to change rather than try and resist it. Adaptation requires almost a kind of humility. Not just something like saying, I could be wrong, while not actually being open to an alternate solution, but genuine acknowledgement that your current model of reality is almost certainly incomplete in ways that you can't see yet. The people who fail to adapt are usually people who are very, very confident in their model that worked well for a long time. Their model that might have gotten reinforced by success that made them more confident in the model. And when the world changed in a way that the model couldn't capture, their model collapses and their success collapses with that. Dalio saw this happen in the markets over and over again, actually. Investors who had a great decade and then blew up spectacularly in the next one. Strategies that worked brilliantly in one economic environment and catastrophically in another. He also saw it in himself. The 1982 collapse was was partly a story about Dalio's overconfidence in his model, about believing in this model that wasn't necessarily wrong, but incomplete. The response that he had wasn't to become less confident. It was rather to build better systems for stress testing his confidence, to seek out perspectives that could challenge his views rather than affirm them. And to keep asking a question that had served him well since his collapse in 1982. What am I missing? And I want to step back from the specifics of economics here for a second and try to name what I think the deeper thing is here. Because you could listen to everything we talked about today and listen to it almost as a set of management techniques or investing heuristics. And I think some of it is that, but there's a more fundamental idea underneath all of that, a more philosophical idea. It's about the relationship between self and reality. Most of us, most of the time, relate ourselves to reality through a self-made filter of our preferences and our ego, our desire to be right, to look competent. We don't really encounter reality directly. We encounter reality as we want it to be, or reality as it reflects on us, or reality as it confirms what we already think, or any one of these things that just reaffirms ourselves. Dalio spent decades trying to thin down that statement, to develop habits of mind and structures and personal practices that would force him closer to what's actually true, to see what is really reality, just reality, plainly, regardless of how it made him feel. And the reason this matters is that reality is the only thing that produces outcomes. You can believe whatever you want, feel confident about whatever you want, and in the short run, you can sometimes make those things work. Circumstances can be forgiving, and maybe the inaccuracies don't quite matter, but over time, over a long arc, those inaccuracies add up. Circumstances aren't always forgiving, and reality wins. The gap between your model and what's actually true eventually expresses itself at some point in the outcome. Dalio's entire philosophy is narrowing that gap, systematically narrowing that gap, continuously narrowing that gap, with the explicit acknowledgement that you can never fully close that gap. You will always be operating with an incomplete model, but that you can keep making it a little better day by day. And he puts it this way: success isn't about being right all the time. It's about becoming slightly less wrong over time. And I think that's genuinely the most profound idea he has here, even though it sounds modest, because it reframes the entire project of learning and growth as something that can never finish. There's no moment of arrival. There's no threshold of expertise that you reach after the work is done. There's just the ongoing practice of looking clearly at what happened, extracting the lesson, learning, and adjusting. So the one idea for today, if I had to name one, is this: the quality of your decisions over a lifetime depends on the quality of your relationship with being wrong. Not your intelligence, not on your education or your work ethic or anything else that you've built up over years, on whether you can look at your failures honestly and ask what they're trying to teach you. Dalio didn't arrive at this idea naturally. He arrived at it through one of the most painful professional failures imaginable. In his early 30s, after betting everything on a view that turned out to be wrong. And instead of moving on, he stayed with that experience long enough to really understand it. And I think that's the practice that can be taken from this, really. Stay with failure long enough to understand it. Ask what you missed, update the model, and all in all, just keep going. Thanks for listening to One Idea Away.